Okay, so good morning, everybody, and welcome to this second webinar in the series from the Interacoustics Academy. The first webinar was hosted 2 weeks ago by my colleague Jos, and what we did there is we looked at OAEs and did a theoretical introduction to that, and that webinar can be found on our website. Today the webinar is going to be focusing on performing relay measurements, and in particularly with the Callisto device. We will be looking at this from more of a clinical perspective rather than a technical one. But let's crack on with today's webinar, and we can go from there. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Lee Martin, and I'm an audiologist by training and clinical experience, but 2 years ago I joined the Interacoustics Academy into the role of international clinical trainer. So I have a very nice position where I get to travel all over the world and provide training on all aspects of the Interacoustics product range. I'm actually from the UK, and that's where I'm calling you from today. So it's a quite early start for me today, but that's all good. And I hope we'll have a good session ahead. But please do contact me on my email address or by telephone should you have any questions in the future. I'm more than happy to get those answered for you, or try at least to answer them the best I possibly can. So, with respect to today's webinar, let's quickly go over the learning objectives. Firstly, what I want to do is to make you aware of the considerations that clinicians should take into account before performing relay measurements. These considerations actually only take a very short amount of time, but they are quite important to make sure you've covered in order to get the best results from the relay measurement. The second thing I want to spend a little bit of time on is talking about how you can insert the probe tube. Firstly, so that it's in an accurate position, so the measurements which you take are going to be proper. But secondly, to overcome the myths which some audiologists have of the fear of putting it in. Of course, audiologists are putting impression material in the ears every day to take ear mold impressions, and this probe tube insertion is a much easier task than taking an impression. So I will overcome the myths and give you some advice on how to put the probe tube in. After that, I will give you an awareness of how the REM is run clinically in the context of an initial hearing aid fitting. So REM can be used in several different clinical scenarios. And the initial hearing aid fitting is probably the most common way people are using REM. So I'll focus on the initial fitting for today. So I guess we need to identify exactly what relay measurements are if we're going to be talking about them for the next 40 minutes. So relay measurements are an objective verification of hearing aid which take into account the individual's own ear canal acoustics. So what we're doing there is that we're realizing that people have different shaped and sized ears, and that their ear canal actually has an effect on how well the hearing aid is going to be able to sound. With big ears providing less sound pressure in the ear canal, and small ears providing more sound pressure in the ear canal, you can actually have quite variable differences between individuals with identical hearing losses. So it's important to actually take into account these ear canal characteristics when doing the hearing aid fitting. With relay measurements, there are several different ways in which you can perform them. The first is to do ear-based measurements, which we typically do on the adult population. And then the second measurement you can do is coupler-based measurements, which we typically do on the pediatric population. Ear-based measurements can be crudely broken down into two main areas. The first is insertion gain measurements, and the second is real aided response measurements. Coupler-based measurements typically form RECD measurements, and we're not going to be focusing on those today. And in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on one of the ear-based measurements, and that's the real ear aided response, as this is the most commonly used measurement we're finding today. So let's just have a quick look at the equipment setup. And what we can see is we have a Callisto and a loudspeaker on the screen. And the loudspeaker is important because that's what's going to produce the sounds which are going to verify the hearing aid against. The next we have a second component which is a reference microphone, and that sits on the ear, or just outside the ear should I say. So with the reference microphone, it's actually, if I put a tick on it, it's this little black region here. So and the actual reference microphone itself is found right at the top of here. That's going to collect the sound from the loudspeaker and ensure that it's the right intensity. The next part we need to perform real ear measurements is a probe tube. So an in situ probe microphone. So what we have is inside the ear we have an in situ probe, so we can click it here, and that's connected to the reference module. What we then need to have, of course, is some software which we're going to interpret the results against. And what we're going to do is we're going to measure what the hearing aid is doing inside the ear and then be able to display that on screen. So the process is that sound is made by the loudspeaker. You should now be seeing some sound waves coming across. Then what we do is we measure the sound at the reference microphone to ensure it's at the correct intensity. Then the effect of the ear and the hearing aid is measured in the ear canal by the probe microphone. And that effect is then displayed graphically on the screen for the clinician to see. And we can see the red line on the screen appearing now. So the idea is to match the hearing aid real ear amplification to the grey target line on the screen. So before we do that, there's some considerations that we need to take into account for, and we can break those down into several different steps. The first of those steps is to actually look at the condition of the ear canal. It's important to do this because certain ear canal conditions can actually prevent us from performing real ear measurement. Next, we need to look at the hearing loss of the patient and make sure that we have enough data in order to generate a prescription to fit to. Then we need to choose the real ear method, and like I say, today we're going to be using the real ear aided response. And we also need to choose a prescription which we're going to be fitting the hearing aid to. Then we need to prepare the hearing aid and the hearing aid fitting software, so that's all going to be working in the right way, and it's going to also correlate well with what's being displayed in the REM software. After that, we need to calibrate the probe tube. Each probe tube which goes into the ear has its own frequency response which we need to remove and take into account for. So probe tube calibration is an important thing before doing the real ear measurement. We then need to choose the stimulus which is going to come out of the loudspeaker. We need to get the patient into position, and then we need to fit the probe tube into the ear. So all these steps, although there's quite a few of them, actually in clinical practice, they only take a couple of minutes or even less to actually perform. And I have videos for each of these steps, and we can go through those now. So the first of those steps was looking at the condition of the ear canal. So what I have is, there's me on the left, and we have Jos, who's going to be playing the role of the patient today. And what I have is a video otoscope, the Viet, and we're going to have a look inside his ear and see if it's fit to perform real ear measurements. So if I begin playing the video now, we can see the otoscope going into the ear, a little bit of wax at the beginning, and then as we get past that we can see a nice clear image of Jos's eardrum. Now it's important to inspect the entire ear canal. Firstly, you want to make sure that there isn't too much wax. A little bit of wax like what Jos had in his ear is absolutely fine, and you can perform real ear measurements in that situation. However, if the wax is blocking the ear canal and you can't get a probe tube in there, then of course that's going to be a contraindication to performing the measurement. So if there is too much wax, then it's important to have that removed before performing the real ear measurement. The other thing to take into consideration is actually if the ear canal is of a normal shape and size. For instance, if it is abnormal, in the sense that there could be a tympanic membrane perforation or there could be a mastoid cavity, then the recommendation from Harvey Dillon in the Now laboratories is that if there is the presence of a perforation or mastoid cavity, then we should always perform a real ear aided response measurement. And if the ear canal is more normal, then you can actually then choose your preference between real ear aided response or real ear insertion gain. But we can see that Jos's ear canal is nice and clear, so what we can then do is move on to the second step. And the second step is the hearing loss of the patient. So it's important that we put the correct audiometric data into the suite. Now the Callisto of course actually has an audiometer module embedded into it, but what I won't do is I won't do a whole audiogram and show you a video of that, because doing that over a webinar is not going to be the most interesting thing to watch. But what I will do is just highlight some important facts. Okay, so if you're running it through NOAA, it's always important to have the patient selected and then opening up the Callisto suite. That way the hearing aid data and the REM data will all be saved to that patient. So now what I'm doing is just inputting an audiogram into the suite. So this could have been measured on a separate device. With air conduction thresholds, it's important that we actually input a sufficient number of thresholds. And what I mean there is that certain prescription formulae require that you have certain thresholds measured. It's important that you know what are the requirements for the prescription formula and ensure you have enough audiometric information. Then the next thing you want to do is also to make sure that the bone conduction values are also put into the audiogram, and that's because some prescription formulae will actually account for whether or not there's a conductive hearing loss. So it's important to take these conductive hearing losses into consideration. At the end of the measurement, what I want to do is press the Save button so that that's all embedded into the software suite. And then we're ready to continue. So with the audiogram selected, what we can then do is open up the REM module. So when you open up the real ear measurement software, what you need to do is to choose the prescription or the method, sorry, which you're going to verify the hearing aid to. And as you can see, that was from the drop-down menu on the left-hand side. And as soon as you opened up that drop-down menu, the prescription window opened up, and you could choose which prescription you wanted to fit your hearing aid to. Once you've chosen the prescription, what it will do is it will ask you to identify a certain number of criteria. This is unique to the prescription itself. It's not something which we at Interacoustics designed. It's actually the specifications from the prescription. So what you need to do is to go down and choose the appropriate settings for each of these boxes. Once you have those settings all set up, then we're ready to actually generate the target and to move on. So the next thing we need to do is to set the hearing aid up, and what we do is we're going to demonstrate that on an Oticon hearing aid today. So first of all, you want to detect the hearing aid temperature which we're going to fit, and then what we're going to do is then open up the actual hearing aid settings. So the audiogram which was saved into the Callisto is now in the hearing aid suite, so we know that's going to be identical. And then what we're going to do is then look at the personal profile, ensure that the correct age has been selected. Then we can actually change the acoustics. We're going to change the vent. If the venting option isn't the same in the hearing aid as it is in the and the real ear measurement software, then just click the closest one. Lastly, what you want to do is to actually choose the prescription formula, which you've also chosen in the REM screen, sorry. So what you want to do then is program the hearing aid up. And with hearing aids, it's important that if they have an adaptation manager or equivalent, that this is set on full, so that you actually got the real ear measurement set up for when the hearing aid is actually on full gain. The other thing you can do is actually change the graph which you're viewing in the hearing aid fitting software, so it's going to actually represent the same type of graph which you're going to be seeing in the real ear measurement software for consistency. Then you can program the hearing aid up, and the hearing aid is now ready to perform real ear measurements. Some clinicians will argue that you should turn the hearing aid features off for the real ear measurement to be performed, whilst others argue that you can leave them on. And from my experience, now that we have the new stimulus, the international speech test signal, which I'll talk about I think on the next slide, we can actually now leave the hearing aid features switched on and perform real ear measurements. So the hearing aid is now set up. We can then continue. Okay, so I lied to you because we're going to talk about probe tube calibration this time. So, of course, as I mentioned, it's important to get that probe tube calibrated before we do the measurement. And let's see how we do this. So what we can see is that there's a button in the software which is actually dedicated to the probe tube calibration. When you press it, two windows will appear. You can calibrate an SPL probe, which is for RECD measurements, or the regular probe, which is for traditional real ear measurements. And we're going to select the regular probe measurement. There's instructions on what to do. You need to align the probe microphone with the reference microphone and place it in front of the speaker. What we can see here is a video of me doing those things. So placing the probe microphone on and aligning it with the reference microphone. Now it's held up to the speaker. In that position, you can press OK, and then you'll run a measurement. And then what we're expecting to see on this measurement is a nice smooth curve rolling off in the high frequencies when using the Callisto. If you don't get that curve or something similar, then it's normally a result that something has gone wrong. So here are two curves where the probe tube calibration has actually been faulty. The top curve actually shows that actually what the clinician did is they had the probe tube connected to the right reference microphone, and actually what they did is in the software they selected the left ear, and what they got is this strange looking curve. So not smooth and not rolling off. We can see that this curve is clearly abnormal. The lower curve is actually, they have the correct ear selected, but what they haven't done is they haven't aligned the probe tube with the reference microphone. So what that means is that they're not going to be at the same position, and that causes a graph that looks very bumpy. And if you see this graph, then I would recommend you to actually realign the probe with the reference microphone and run the measurement again. And then you should find that the curve becomes nice and smooth like we saw on the previous slide. We have a series of different stimuli in the suite, and the ISTS is now recommended to be used as your real ear measurement fitting stimulus. There are others which have had published data and are also in ANSI and IEC standards. But the international speech test signal, the beauty of this signal is that it's a mixture of 6 different languages, and it's been especially made for the purpose of performing real ear measurements. But this is the stimulus which we are most recommending to perform verification again. So moving on, we then need our patient, and as I mentioned, Jos is our patient today. So what we need to do is to get him positioned correctly. So with respect to positioning, it's important that the patient is going to be between 0.5 meter and 1 meter's distance from the loudspeaker, and also that they are going to be at the same height as the loudspeaker. So the loudspeaker will be producing the sound at ear level. If that can't be achieved, then it's important to angle the loudspeaker up so that it at least is pointing in the direction of the ear. The other thing you can actually have the patient doing is looking so they're sat looking directly at the speaker, and that's known as 0 degrees azimuth, or they can be looking at 45 degrees. So that means that rather than their nose pointing at the speaker, it's pointing 45 degrees away. And either method is acceptable. It's just recommended to specify that method in the hearing aid fitting prescription, as we saw previously on the last about 3 slides ago. But with the patient set up, we are now ready to put the probe tube into their ear. So as I mentioned, I think probe tube placement is the biggest barrier which audiologists find towards real ear measurement. And here are just a couple of techniques on what you can use to actually overcome this issue. So the first method is to actually take advantage of the black marker on the probe tube. Here, if I click, we can see there's a tick there, and that's the black marker on the probe tube. That can actually be adjusted to different sizes. So you can actually move a predefined size, align the black marker to it, and then insert the probe tube into the ear. So the black marker then sits right at the entrance of the ear canal, as indicated here. This is a useful technique because what you can do is you can be pretty confident that you're never going to get too close to the eardrum because you're using a set measurement. So the British Society of Audiology recommends using a size of 27 millimeters from the end of the probe tube to the black marker, and then placing that into the ear canal. So that is a way which you can use to actually make sure that the tube is going to be in the correct position each time. Of course, it's important, however, to perform otoscopy, and this is particularly important for further estimating the probe depth. So what you can do with otoscopy, of course, is to look inside the ear canal and see if it's actually longer or shorter than normal. So for instance, if you had an adult with Down syndrome who had a shorter ear canal, then you might want to reconsider the 27 millimeter length. So the 27 millimeter length from the BSA is recommended for a normal adult ear canal. So if it's abnormally short, then of course you can adjust the probe tube to be a little bit shorter. If the ear canal is very long, then of course you can make that 27 millimeters just a little bit longer. So combining the two methods is the best way to make sure that the probe tube will be inserted properly. Lastly, what you want to do is to verify that the probe tube is in position correctly, and you can do that by measuring something known as the real ear unaided gain. So what that condition is that having the probe tube in the ear canal, but with no hearing aid inside, just the probe tube, and then what you do is you produce the sound from the loudspeaker, and then you're measuring how much sound is being picked up by the probe tube, and you express that as a gain curve. And what we have on the next slide is an example of what a REUG curve looks like. And this is very typical for an average ear canal. What we can see is that the curve peaks around about 3000 Hertz and rolls off into the higher frequencies. The important thing to note is that in the high frequencies at 6000 Hertz, it's important to make sure that the real ear unaided gain is actually higher than -5. If it's below -5, then this can suggest that there are standing waves in the ear canal. If I show you an example of a poorly placed probe tube, here we can see that actually at -5, if I just put a little tick on it, you can see that the unaided gain curve has dipped below -5, suggesting that standing waves are present and that the probe tube is in a poor position. Whereas on the good probe tube insertion graph, we can see that at 6000 Hertz, it's above -5 dB. So we can actually say that's actually acceptable and the probe tube placement is good. So really, it's a combination of all three methods is going to give you most confidence in knowing that the probe tube is accurately placed. So use otoscopy to judge the size of the ear canal. If it looks normal, then measure a probe tube, the black marker, 27 millimeters from the end. Insert the probe tube so it sits along the bottom of the ear canal, and then lastly run the real ear unaided gain, and then this will tell you whether or not it's in the correct position. For real ear aided response measurements, the real ear unaided gain is not needed to actually take into account for the real ear measurement, but it does tell you about whether or not the probe is in a good position or not. If you're going to use insertion gain measurement, you have to run the real ear unaided gain measurement anyway, so it's not any additional work. So, with the probe tube in place, let's see if we can make a video demonstrating this. So in the software, you press the REUG button, and then what you can then do is it gives you instructions. Here you can see a video of me measuring the probe tube. We actually have a ruler on the module itself. Then you put the REM headset over the patient's ears, and then you place the probe in until the black marker is at the entrance of the ear canal. Inside the software, you press OK, and then what will happen is we'll measure the REUG, and we can see that at 6000 Hertz, it's above -5 dB, and then that tells us that we're happy that this probe tube is inserted correctly. So now that everything's all set up, we're actually ready to do the main bulk of the work, which is the real ear unaided response measurement itself. And what I've done is I've broken this down into two videos. So what we'll do is we can just talk over the video and we'll go from there. So what we can see is Jos has the probe tube in his ear, and now I'm just putting the hearing aid inside the ear. And notice that you can still see the black probe tube marker at the entrance of the ear canal. And now Jos is ready to have the measurement performed. We select the REAR in the left-hand button list, and then we press start. And then what will happen is, with the hearing aid switched on, of course, we're going to see the response of the hearing aid inside the ear canal, measured at the probe tube microphone. And we can see that in this situation, the hearing aid is providing a little bit too much amplification. So there's a button there which is the on top mode. If you press on top mode, then what will happen is that you will see both the real ear measurement software and the fitting software. And so now all we're doing is reducing the amplification in the frequencies where we can see it being over amplified. We're reducing that down. And then once we're satisfied that we have it at a better level, we can start the measurement again. So here we go. So this is looking better. I don't think we have it perfect yet. So we will then wait for the measurement to finish and then look at where we need to adjust the different frequencies. So we've made the third measurement in the, or we're making the third measurement after the second hearing aid adjustment. And what we can see is that this is starting to look much better and a much more accurate fit to the target. What you can see is that there is a peak at 3000 Hertz, and what some clinicians like to do is actually don't want to see that curve, that peak. So you can actually apply curve smoothing by pushing the shift and the up and down buttons, and actually you can smooth that curve away. Technically that's not the best thing to be doing because of course that peak is still at 3000 Hertz, but if you're not able to make any further adjustments to the hearing aid, then you can actually apply the curve smoothing, and you can see it looks a much better fit to target. Then we need to verify at a loud intensity of 75 dB or 80 dB, depending on the parameters of the hearing aid. And again, we can see we select that from the software and we just press start, and then we're running with a louder intensity stimulus. And then you can make appropriate adjustments, or you can actually see what's happening at the lower intensities. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a verification at 50 dB. It says 55 on the graph at the minute, but I'll soon change that to 50. And then we can then run the measurement and see what's going to happen. Okay, so at 50, we're looking like it's not too bad a fit to target, and it's looking pretty good. So then at that stage, what you can do is you could either increase the curve smoothing to see what it's going to have an effect on, but of course you can then either accept the measurement that you have or continue to reduce the intensity of the loud stimuli. Once finished, you save the measurement into the fitting software, then you exit and save the measurement into the fitting or the hearing aid, and then that's the real ear measurement completed. So all in all, it doesn't take very long at all to get these measurements recorded. So that sort of takes us to the end of our sort of clinical journey, and let's just recap on the learning outcomes which I said at the beginning of. So what I wanted to do was firstly make you aware of the considerations a clinician should take into account before performing the real ear measurements. And of course we need to do otoscopy, we need to make sure that the correct prescription is chosen, we need to make sure that the probe tube is calibrated, the stimulus has been taken into account. All these should only take a couple of minutes to perform. Then we looked at ways in which we can put the probe tube into the ear, and we said that the best way is to use a three-method approach. Firstly, perform otoscopy, make an estimate of the ear canal size. If it's normal, then use the BSA recommended length of 27 millimeters in adults. And then lastly, perform the real ear unaided gain measurement to see whether or not the probe is in place. And if at 6000 Hertz you're getting a real ear unaided gain of minus 5 dB or greater, then that tells you that the probe tube perhaps isn't in the best location. Then lastly, we showed you how you do a real ear aided response measurement in the context of initial hearing aid fitting, and I'd encourage you to re-watch this video if you have any queries, and of course we have opportunity for questions now. And I'm pleased to see that there's some questions appearing on the screen, which is great. Before I answer those questions, I do want to just direct you to two things, and that is the Academy website, which if you do want to get more information on real ear measurements, then we have a whole host of materials such as e-learning courses and short quick guide videos on all sorts of different aspects of real ear measurement. So I do encourage you to visit this area. So that's introacoustics.com/academy, or you can just access it from the main homepage, and you'll actually see that there's lots of materials present. But with that in mind, let's see if we can answer these questions. And please do write any more questions which any of you else have in the instant messaging column, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. So the first question is, will you always use speech stimuli when performing the measurement? And the answer to that question is, for me, I would always use a speech stimulus when actually measuring the hearing aid against a target, because the hearing aid is designed to amplify speech. So actually you want to see how well the hearing aid is responding to a speech-based stimulus. In that situation, of course, then you always want to be performing real ear measurements using a speech-based stimulus. In the past, we've used noise because we've not actually had a calibrated speech-based stimuli, but now we have the international speech test signal. I would always use that stimuli when performing real ear measurements. Of course, if you want to do a verification such as making sure the directional microphones are working, then you could use or if noise management's doing anything, then you could use a non-speech based stimulus to see the effect of what's happening. But when measuring against a target, then I would always use a speech-based stimulus. And I believe there were two questions. Okay. So one of the most common complaints when fitting a hearing aid is its own voice. In my opinion, do we think we can use the real ear unaided gain or other measures to assess that? That's a good question. What you can actually do is, I wouldn't really use the real ear unaided gain measurement to assess that. One thing you can do is, if you're fitting an open fit hearing aid, is you can measure the real ear occluded gain, which is the condition where you have the hearing aid inside the ear but switched off. Now, what you can actually then do is look at the real ear occluded gain, and if you see that the line to be sort of flat or dipping in the minus values, then actually that's going to tell you that the hearing aid is actually not a true open fitting, and it's actually it's blocking the ear, and that could cause the patient to actually be suffering from the occlusion effect, and then they'd be hearing their own voice more. So an option then you could do would be to try and use a more open hearing aid dome, such as an open dome rather than a closed dome, for instance. That's the way which I would use these measurements to assess how occluding the ear mold is. I guess the other reason why patients can hear their own voice is a phenomenon called amp occlusion, where you're actually providing too much low frequency gain. So I guess the way to get around that, of course, would be to make sure that you haven't over amplified the low frequencies. So that way you'll be looking at your real ear aided response or insertion gain measurement and making sure that that's matching target and not over amplifying. So a combination of the two should be able to give you insight into whether or not occlusion is occurring and the patient will be overhearing their own voice. Again, thank you very much for tuning in today, and I'd like to say thanks again and goodbye.